Previously we've done a deep dive on Pokemon Sun and Moon, as well as Pokemon X and Y. So today we're taking the next step and covering Generation 5, one of the most ambitious eras in Pokemon history. The goal of this video isn't to rehash well-known topics, instead I want to focus on details that you probably haven't heard before. The details that add so much to the history of Black and White. Regardless, I'll try to cover as much ground as possible when it comes to Generation 5. So without further ado, let's drop you right into the mix with a really cool detail found in one of the Black and White beta builds. At first glance, this just looks like the Castelia City Pokemon Center, right? I mean, we've all been here 1,000 times. What could be so special about it? Well, take a closer look. Notice the second entrance towards the right side of the building. If you've connected the dots, you might realize that this was directly inspired by the Nintendo store in New York, which was formerly known as the New York Pokemon Center. This building also has a dual-sided entrance, and it's located at the corner of Rockefeller Plaza. It makes perfect sense that Gamefreak would incorporate this into Castelia's Pokemon Center, considering the city itself is based on Manhattan. But this dual entrance never made it into the final game. So the big question is, why was it removed? The fact that the Pokemon Center was designed with two entrances means that the interior would need to be adjusted as well. And while that might seem like a simple fix, by just adding a door to the side of a building, Gamefreak probably wanted to make this Pokemon Center interior feel more unique like they have done with previous special Pokemon Centers. Unfortunately, in the final version, the dual entrance was removed, and the Pokemon Center uses the standard design seen throughout the rest of the game. It's kind of a shame, because this could have been a really cool detail. Speaking of New York, there was another early idea for Unova that would have made the region feel even more like NYC. Originally, Gamefreak planned for Unova's routes to have a naming convention inspired by real-world New York streets. For example, instead of Route 525, it would have been something like Route 525, North Pikachu Avenue. Routes would actually have compass directions to indicate where they were located on the map. This idea might sound a little extra, but honestly, I love this idea. Gamefreak thought this naming convention would be easier to understand, which maybe it would, but to me it just seems like a perfect addition that fits a big city setting. One of the more ambitious cut features from Pokemon Black and White was an expanded set of trainer classes. This would be a departure from the typical trainer classes from previous games and introduce a wider range of professions like nursery teachers, bakers, sports trainers representing different popular sports, university students, and of course office workers and bosses. There was even a mechanic for seasonal trainers where some trainer classes would only appear during certain seasons, such as summer camp trainers showing up in the summer. Another cut feature was the International Trainers feature, a special group of 7 NPCs that would each speak a different language based on the Pokemon game's localization. The idea was that you'd encounter these trainers throughout Unova, they would speak their native language when you battled them, and if you managed to defeat all 7, a special event would trigger. Pokemon Black and White were pitched on April 13, 2007, just months after Gamefreak had released Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, which was seen by Gamefreak as the culmination of everything built up to that point, and the ultimate Pokemon games. So the next step? Gamefreak wanted Black and White to be games that are the polar opposite of each other, creating two contrasting versions that would push players to play both. The earliest concepts for Black and White suggested that the game would take place largely within a city modeled after Manhattan. You would navigate the city using a public transit system. Maybe instead of flying between cities, you'd have to take a train or a bus. This concept makes it sound like Unova may have originally been a single massive city, rather than a full region with multiple towns. If that's the case, Black and White could have been an entirely urban Pokemon game. It's a concept Gamefreak have since revisited, and it makes me wonder why Legends EA didn't take place in Castelia City. We were all expecting a Unova-based game anyway, but instead we got Lumio City. Perhaps they're saving the idea for later on. In this version of Pokemon Black and White, there was a major building in the central city, inspired by the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. This building would be off limits until you completed the game, and I'm assuming it was directly tied to the Hakai gang, a mysterious group that had taken over the Pokemon League. The Hakai gang, which translates to Team Destruction, had a radical goal that changed depending on the version. In Pokemon Black, they'd want to destroy futuristic architecture. In Pokemon White, they'd want to destroy historical architecture. This makes them very different from Team Plasma, who wanted Pokemon liberation, at least on the surface. Instead, the Hakai gang seemed more focused on altering Unova's history and infrastructure. The team was led by one boss, but 7 sages acted as the core members. possibly making up the elite class of the organization, and the league would be in crisis, with no active champion until you stepped in. As the player, your mission would be to unravel their true motivations and defeat their leader at the end of the game. It's a very different take on the Pokemon League, making it feel less like a tournament and more like a final dungeon. Again, a hint of this idea made it into the final game with a climax, but I absolutely love the idea of a league being treated like a dungeon instead of following the traditional structure. The concept was ultimately scrapped and replaced by Team Plasma. But I do want to know your thoughts. Would this have made for a better story, or do you think Team Plasma's approach was the right direction? I quickly want to slip in a detail about a fascinating discovery in the black and white beta builds. A cut soundtrack which is a cover of Mariya Takeuchi's Shiawase no Monosashi, recreated using the same instruments used for Undella Town's theme. I'll play the full audio at the end of the video, so stay tuned. One of the most fascinating details from Pokemon Black and White's development was the original plan for mythical Pokemon distributions. The plan outlined 4 different mythical Pokemon, each releasing annually from 2011 to 2014. Their designs were reportedly inspired by past mythicals. 2011 would have had a Darkrai-inspired Pokemon. 2012 would have had a more adorable Pokemon inspired by Jirachi. 2013 would have had a cool and mysterious Pokemon inspired by Deoxys, and 2014 would have had a cute, mysterious yet powerful Pokemon similar to Mew. While the exact names and designs of these Pokemon aren't listed in the leak, we did end up with exactly 4 mythical Pokemon in Generation 5. Also, the fact Generation 6 arrived in 2013 suggests that Generation 5's timeline was shortened. I wonder what the reason for a shorter generation was, and I wonder if this would have meant we would have seen another black and white game on the 3DS. Perhaps it was due to game sales, or perhaps the idea of a new generation pushed as the first title for the 3DS shortens Generation 5's timeline. I guess we'll never know. A very ambitious mechanic had been planned for Pokemon Black and White, the introduction of non-grid based movement, a first for the series at the time. Pokemon games had always relied on tile-based movement, but Unova's city-inspired design meant Gamefreak wanted to experiment with something new. By the wording, the original plan seems to suggest that players could toggle between grid-based movement and free movement, with the free movement being specifically designed for curved roads, stairs, and junctions. One notable early concept involved a circular building, a structure that wouldn't work smoothly with traditional grid-based controls. The concept was actually playable in some of the beta builds, giving us an early look at how Gamefreak envisioned the idea in Unova. The Sky Arrow Bridge level was one of the earliest environments built for the game, and it displays the best example of a non-grid based movement. While the final game has some stunning fixed angles that changed as you progress the bridge, this beta build had fully 3D camera controls, and surprisingly the controls were actually intuitive. Despite the camera controls taking over the face buttons, I could totally see how pressing the L button or R button would switch your face button functionality between the cameras and the general Pokemon controls. Perhaps the vision we see in the final game gives us an idea of how gameplay would be if you chose grid-based movement. Another beta scenario lets the player explore a beta version of Violet City with non-grid based movement. This was likely Gamefreak testing how free movement could work in a traditional 2D Pokemon town. And again, the visuals and the controls work surprisingly good. Another beta feature was a rotatable battle camera, allowing players to freely move the perspective during battles. While the scenario could have just been a test to experiment with dynamic battle visuals, it's still fascinating to see how far Gamefreak were pushing the DS hardware. The 3D camera in the overworld was still present throughout development of Black and White, and it's still present in the files of the final Black and White games. Even though the Unova we know today may not have been the same design as the original plan, using the 3D camera in some of the scenarios gives us an even better idea of how the camera mechanic would have worked in Unova. I can only imagine how this mechanic would have worked in places like Castelia City. Gamefreak also specifically wanted the player to use the touchscreen more. In this particular scenario of the beta builds, you control the character entirely using the touchscreen. But here's the real game changer. Tapping the touchscreen made the player jump, a mechanic that's never been seen in Pokemon games. The ability to jump could have led to so many possibilities in how the game world was structured, but the feature was ultimately scrapped and never made it into the final game. One of the biggest revelations from the Terra leak was the discovery of an open world beta build for Pokemon Black and White. The scenario takes place in a vast open field with towering mountains, flowing rivers, and freely roaming NPCs and Pokemon sprites. players had full 3D camera control, and the premise presents an open world feel to Pokemon, something that wouldn't officially appear in a Pokemon game until 14 years later. A bold proof of concept that suggests Gamefreak was seriously considering an open world Pokemon game all the way back in Generation 5. You might wonder how an area like this would even fit into Unova. Well, according to early development notes, Unova was originally planned to be surrounded by a mountainous range around the Manhattan-inspired city. This open-world beta map may have been designed to represent the areas outside of the city, giving players vast open landscapes to explore in contrast to the dense urban setting of Castelia city. Looking at these beta builds, it's clear that Gamefreak was far ahead of the curve when it came to experimenting with movement, camera controls, and open-world mechanics. While these ideas didn't make it into the final game, they show that Pokemon has always had the potential to push boundaries, even in the DS era. Even though we never got a Pokemon game like this, these discoveries give us an exciting glimpse into what could have been, and perhaps what could still be in the future. One of the few recorded moves to ever be completely scrapped from a Pokemon game is the move Melt, which was originally planned for Pokemon Black and White. And based on its effects, it's easy to see why Gamefreak decided to remove it, as it could have completely shaken up the competitive meta. You see, Melt was a fire status move, with 100% accuracy and 15 PP, but using Melt would turn the opponent's Steel type into a normal type, and also turn the opponent's Ice type into a Water type. Now, I'm not a competitive player, but that sounds like a pretty big deal even to me. Another major discovery from the leaks was an official timeline graphic detailing when each Pokemon game took place in relation to each other. Here's what it confirms. The Kanto and Hoenn games take place at the same time. The Johto games take place 3 years later. The Sinnoh games take place sometime later, with the Unova games taking place 10 years after Sinnoh. It also explains why technology and infrastructure in Unova feel much more advanced than previous regions, and possibly even why the Kalos games were originally envisioned with a much more futuristic vibe as we saw in the X and Y video. Like with every Pokemon game, of course there were plenty of discarded Pokemon designs. Some of these were early versions of existing Pokemon, while others were entirely original concepts that never made it into the final game, like this planned koala Pokemon. Not much is known about it, and this Pokemon only exists in early concept sketches and mock-ups, and we didn't get a koala Pokemon until Generation 7. In an early draft of a Black and White intro cutscene, there was another glimpse of an unidentified Pokemon. Some speculate this was meant to be a new mythical Pokemon, possibly one of the scrapped event mythicals. However, it doesn't have a sprite, meaning it may have been cut very early in development. In contrast, there's a cut sprite of another Pokemon that many speculate to be a scrapped mythical. I actually like its design too. Shame it was cut. This one snail evolution line also stands out to me, complete with fully designed sprites. It's one of those designs that feel like a staple. There's also this sprite from one of the battles in the beta builds. While it's not in the final game, many speculate that it's a beta design for Caracosta. I've seen a couple mention Druddigon as well, and maybe elements of the design were split into these two Pokemon instead. Mewtwo was allegedly going to receive a new form too. This form was supposedly called Awakened Mewtwo, a concept that seems like it would later evolve into Mega Evolution. Mega Mewtwo Y in particular is believed to have been directly based on this concept, as it even debuted in a Black and White movie. Considering we got Mega Mewtwo X, some even believe that Mega Mewtwo X was specifically designed as the Mega Evolution for Mewtwo, but they still added the Awakened Mewtwo design into X and Y as a Mega Evolution. And with that, we've covered pretty much all of the leaks from Pokemon Black and White. Generation 5 is often considered the peak of 2D Pokemon, and for good reason. From regional design to dynamic sprite animations, to its story-driven approach, to even receiving sequels, Black and White stand as a strong point in the Pokemon series. I'm about to play the scrapped Mariya Takeuchi inspired song, but if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.